In today's Mr. Ballen reaction, we are back on the top 3 places that you can't go, but people went anyway. Now, this is episode 37. I know we was doing them in order, but Mr. Ballen brings out new videos every week, so, you know, we're bound to stumble on the new ones as well. I will go back to the others and catch up on them, though, as I can. Anyway, let's see exactly what Mr. Ballen is going to do to the like button this week. Right, okay, Mr. Ballen, let's see what 3 stories these are. These headphones are stuck in my head. Right, let's get it.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways.
Stupid
but
people.
Before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format,
we are?
Then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button says they need to replace their tires on their Toyota Corolla, offer to do it for them and to pay for them, but make sure you replace their tires with enormous, oversized monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
That was pretty mild. That was pretty mild for Mr. Ballen, that. You just put bigger wheels on the car. Ah, that ain't too bad. Okay, the pilot, let's get it.
On the evening of March 22nd, 1994, a 40-year-old, very experienced airline pilot named Andrei Danilov walked into the cockpit of a huge airplane that he was about to fly out of Moscow. Once he was in the cockpit, he said hello to the 2 other pilots he'd be flying with that night,
okay.
And then Andrei took a seat in the captain's chair. Now, this flight tonight was going to be a very routine 13-hour trip to Hong Kong, something Andrei and these other 2 pilots had done many times before. But this night, Andrei was totally dreading this trip because one of the pilots he'd be flying with that night was a guy that Andrei just could not stand. His name was Yaroslav Kudrinsky, and he was going to be the relief pilot that night.
Right.
So Andrei is the captain and the primary pilot. He has a co-pilot or first officer who sits right next to him, and then behind those 2 would be Yaroslav, the relief pilot, who basically is just there in case the captain or first officer needed a break. And so basically, Andrei was going to be forced to interact with Yaroslav all night long.
Just ignore him.
And so as passengers made their way onto the plane, and as Andrei went through his pre-check procedures to get ready for this flight, Yaroslav just started yapping away about how amazing he was and what a great dad he was because he brought his kids on this flight. You know, they hadn't done a big international flight before, and so he was letting them fly with him that night. And then also Yaroslav began talking about this big surprise he had for his kids that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was.
So he's got, basically, this guy's got a bit of a mouth and he keeps talking. This guy who's flying the plane doesn't like him. Probably because he's got the mouth and he's always boasting or shouting out the big I am sort of thing. Right, okay.
For his kids, that was really going to show what an incredible father he really was. Now, Andrei and the first officer were listening to Yaroslav, but they were basically just completely ignoring him. They're not responding to him, they're not feeding into what he's saying, but Yaroslav didn't care. He just kept on rambling on and on and on about how amazing he was. And so finally, Andrei got clearance to take off. And so even though Yaroslav was totally annoying him, he was able to take off, and they went up to their cruising altitude, and they began making their way towards Hong Kong. And the whole time, you know, Yaroslav's just going on and on and on. And finally, 5 hours into this trip, Yaroslav is still just going on and on and on. And Andrei has just had it. He cannot stand to be around this guy anymore. And so finally, Andrei turned around and just cut off Yaroslav, who was mid-sentence about some anecdote about how strong his son was and what a talented wrestler he was. And so Andrei just cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so
I bet that's not how he said it. I bet he didn't say, listen, I want a break, you know, just take over. I'm going to have a sleep. I bet he went, shut the front door. I'm telling you, that's how it happened. 5 hours of constant yapping. I'm telling you.
cuts him off and is like, Yaroslav, take over. I'm taking a break. I'm going to go sleep for a bit. And so Yaroslav would stop what he was doing. He would stand up. He would take his seat in the captain's chair, and he would take over flying the plane. And so Andrei got up. He left the cockpit. He went to the very back of the plane in the main cabin to this row of seats that was reserved for him and the other pilots. And he got in there, and he laid down, and he closed his eyes. But just a couple of minutes after closing his eyes, Andrei began to feel the plane begin to bank hard to one side. Now, Andrei couldn't really remember if this was the time they were supposed to be turning or not, but it just felt like this turn was more aggressive than anything he anticipated at any point in this journey. But Andrei knew this plane was brand new, and so if there were any kind of minor mistakes that Yaroslav was making flying the plane, well, the autopilot feature, which was state-of-the-art in this plane, would easily correct those small errors and keep the plane going towards its destination.
Okay.
And so, even though, again, they're still in this pretty sharp turn here, Andrei just closed his eyes again and tried to go to sleep. But a couple of minutes later, they were still banking, and in fact, the bank was starting to get even more aggressive, to the point where Andrei opened his eyes and he's thinking to himself, what is Yaroslav doing up there? Like, we're basically going in a circle at this point. We're spiraling midair. And so right as Andrei was about to get up and go see what the heck was going on, the plane began to shake really violently, and suddenly Andrei realized, oh my goodness, the plane could be stalling right now. There could be a real issue in the cockpit.
Sugar.
And this is not some minor error. And so as passengers on the plane are starting to sense that something could be wrong here, I mean, the plane is like hard to the side and shaking, so people are starting to scream and cry, people are nervous. And so Andrei, he begins to stand up to go to the cockpit when suddenly the plane goes from just shaking and banking to basically rolling completely on its side.
Wow.
So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not.
Can you imagine? Can you imagine being on that plane like that? Can you imagine sitting there sideways, your plane's proper on its side, and you're thinking, these guys are supposed to be like making us land somewhere. You know what I mean? That would be absolutely terrifying. I can't stand flying. I hate it. If I didn't have to get on a plane in the rest of my life, I wouldn't do it.
So all the windows are now on the ground and everybody's on their side. Andrei knew he could not go to the cockpit. There was no way to do that. And so all he could do was just hold on to his seat and pray they got out of this. And then just as quickly as all this started, it stopped. The plane kind of went back to level, it stopped shaking, and then Andrei heard the sound of the twin engines out on the wings roar as if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay.
I've seen something like this in a one of those programs on the, what's it called? It's not Seconds Before Disaster. It's something to do with aeroplanes, and it's like, what was it called now? Something to do with like when certain airplane crashes and they find the fault. I forget what it's called now. But there was a thing in the tail, and it's like a little lever that switches left and right. So, you know, for the sort of the rudder type thing on it, and it froze, and it kept making the plane do that. And thankfully, they landed that one. But I mean, later on on another story on another day, the plane did that and it crashed, and they found out that the part was frozen. You know what I mean? And that's what was doing it. I wonder if this is a similar sort of story.
As if the plane was kind of getting back up to speed, and for a second, it seemed like everything was okay.
Aircraft
so
investigation.
This was his chance to get back to the cockpit and frankly just reassume command, because whatever was going on in there, it was not okay. And so Andrei, he got up and began running down the aisle to get to the cockpit. But right as he was about to grab the door, the plane suddenly tilted upward and they began rocketing up into the sky, so strong that Andrei was pinned to the carpet. And so for a couple of seconds, Andrei couldn't do anything, but then he began to hear the sound of the actual frame of the plane beginning to crack from all the pressure of accelerating so quickly up into the sky. And so with all of his strength, Andrei reached up, he's on his hands and knees, and he grabs the door handle to the cockpit and he opens it up, and the second he looks into the cockpit, he would have known exactly what was wrong. It would turn out Yaroslav's big surprise for his kids that he promised Andrei and the first officer would demonstrate what an amazing father he was that he was going to let his kids fly the plane just for a second, but these are untrained children.
Oh, what? Are you kidding me? Oh my God. How can you be that stupid? Wow.
Fly the plane, just for a second, but these are untrained children that have no idea how to fly a plane. And so when Andre got up and went to go take a nap and Yaroslav took over, well, Yaroslav called up his kids who were in the main cabin, a teenage son and daughter, and they went into the cockpit and they sat down in the captain's chair and they began to fly the plane. And the daughter took the seat first in the captain's chair, and she was very careful not to touch any of the controls, even though Yaroslav was kind of encouraging her, you know, to take the wheel and really see what it feels like. But she was nervous, and so she really didn't touch anything. But then Yaroslav's son, when he sat down in the captain's chair, he did grab the controls and he pulled on the wheel hard enough that he somehow disengaged the autopilot feature.
Oh my God.
And nobody noticed. And so as Yaroslav's son is yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began...
Throttles on idle. Go away, Elder, go away. I'll tell you to go away. What the hell? What the hell? See, flying a plane is not playing Xbox, is it? You know what I mean?
Yanking forward and backwards on the yoke, so the steering wheel of the plane began going in all these crazy directions because there was no autopilot to stop it. And by the time he had figured out what was wrong, it was too late because the plane had entered into an unrecoverable stall and it crashed into the foothills of Siberia, killing all 75 people on board. Thank you to...
What an absolute whopper. What an idiot. There's a difference between saying, kids, you fly the plane, or kids, you can sit in the seat and don't touch anything. The girl had sense. The kid was obviously a bonehead and she went, hey, it's like a game, this. Oh my God. That guy, what an idiot. What an idiot. What an absolute idiot. That was freaking irresponsible. Irresponsible. Can't believe that story. Right, okay, the blue door. Let's go.
On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Okay. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain. And so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it. But despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse. She was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, we really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at. But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, you know what? I'm taking you to the hospital.
Yeah,
and so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, you know, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, you know, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection, and so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is, and then hopefully we can treat it. And so
last time we watched one of these where they were running tests because someone wouldn't go to hospital, they ended up with rabies. So it's going to go there, isn't it? He's going to go there.
Is run some tests to figure out what this infection is, and then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her.
Yeah.
Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to
So she's still there then, isn't she? She's not just despondent and then, you know, not realizing where she is. She knows that she wants to get out of that hospital. Right, okay.
Was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, you know, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, you know, she's ambulatory. That's going to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, you know, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second. And then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway.
Aren't they alarmed, though? That the emergency exits are alarmed, aren't they? Sure.
Door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway. She looks down the long side to the right. Then she looks to the left. She sees the blue door. And she goes to the blue door. She opens it up. And she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours. And so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas. And they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day...
What do you reckon? What do you reckon through that blue door? Do you reckon she's fell down a fire escape or something?
17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on, where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this
real photo of the outdoor landings. Right, okay. So like balconies then, aren't they?
Help. In order to explain what happened next, you need to look at this picture. So in this picture, on the right-hand side, you see there are two outdoor landings with people on them. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went into the stairwell and she went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor. And she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so
she starved to death, do you think? Why wouldn't you just go out? I know she's made it down one flight. I mean, you just keep going, wouldn't you? Even no matter what your mental state is, you don't just go, oh, the door didn't open. And then I'll stay there.
On the 4th floor landing. Again, you got to remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing. And a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, like, come check it out. And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, They didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn, and then finally...
That's negligence, isn't it? If they've been told someone's there and security didn't take it seriously and left it, they've got to have some of the blame. Not doing the job proper.
So 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn, and then finally on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th
To a
floor,
skeleton.
and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died,
Wow.
so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that
Real
landing.
photo of it
But
as well.
it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately,
That's
Lynn's
crazy.
family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million.
So there was a payout. That's admitting negligence. Oh my God. I mean, how can you not? There's a patient out on the stairwell. There's a patient out on the stairwell. Why is nobody going? That is incompetence at its finest. Wow. The fixer-upper. Right, okay. That's the next story.
On May 28th, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid.
Lake
in
Placid!
Florida.
There's a big crocodile that lives in there. I've seen the films.
Of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful. But the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown. You know, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad.
Yeah,
Because
run
the
down.
owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here. And so they really never came out to check on the property. And so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. You know, all the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn, and so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house.
Right.
And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite.
So she's got no sense of humor. I mean, what could they possibly be laughing at in a derelict house? Maybe there's a homeless guy getting drunk in there. Marguerite, it's Resident Evil 7. Yes, Chris!
Rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, it had a garage, direct access to the water, it even had a boat dock.
And it was
this
cheap.
house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. I mean, anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again.
Yeah.
And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe.
Yeah.
And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home because, again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. I mean, there was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, you know, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home.
All right, okay.
It's like they were being totally disrespectful, both to Marguerite and, frankly, to the owner of this property. I mean, this is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this. And so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, you know, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house. Make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. You know, so they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, you know, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties, and we'll check those out. Yeah. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, you know, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell.
Someone's died in there. It's a Mr. BALLEN video. The owner is never there because the owner died in there. And he's covered in a sheet. Right.
Away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great.
The owner's just come to the house, hasn't he? A tramp has died in there. Right, okay.
Inside this home. But this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent. He knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from. And at some point, he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town.
It wasn't far away, I reckon. I reckon this guy's like a squatter. Bet he was a squatter.
Some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so
all them houses and the homes on that waterfront there. And the one that he goes to rob is the one that looks like it's got the least money. What?
The same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property, and he tries the doors, and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5 foot 2 inches tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first, it went great. You know, he slipped in no problem, and before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got. And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down.
Oh, it's like the caving stories where people stand there and they just starve to death and die. Either that or he's been watching too many Father Christmas videos.
Way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you got to figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare.
Yes.
And without outside help, he had no chance of survival.
I can imagine that's what it's like when you get wrapped by a snake. You know, every time you breathe out, it tightens and tightens and tightens. Only this, in this case, he's going down a chimney and getting stuck and stuck and stuck and stuck and stuck. Wow. Okay, it's one of the ones that makes you feel like this, like the Nutty Putty and the other caving stories that we've checked out on the channel.
Claustrophobic nightmare, and without outside help, he had no chance of survival.
No.
2 days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were two legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And
did they not investigate that? Why didn't they investigate that? That's ridiculous.
They're not so far down that they were touching the ground. They were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, you know, the kind of spooky vibe, you know, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking, this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank. You know, a mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something.
I didn't check
that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property, and so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so
I suppose in the end they are, because he ain't getting out and he's inanimate. What the heck? Oh, you would have. You'd have checked it out, wouldn't you? Come on.
Also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally, they end up leaving, and that was it. But, as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs.
Real photo.
In fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, you know, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house.
That is bad luck, there, isn't it? That is bad luck. You scream someone is and they go, I couldn't have heard that. Do you know what I mean? And then obviously he could have been alive in the house tour because they're laughing at it. Oh my God. Totally avoidable or rescuable.
Chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, you know, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing.
Yeah.
Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did. On the morning of May...
Wow. Okay, so to finish off, we have a nice claustrophobic story about someone getting stuck in a chimney. If you guys like Mr. Ballen, then go and subscribe to his channel, give him some love, etc., because he makes great videos, makes great stories, and tells them in an absolutely brilliant way. But, I mean, how many times do we see this in these plane disaster stories where it's the pilot's fault? We watched the JFK one tonight where it's JFK's fault. We watched a guy tonight with his kids. His kids fly the plane. Ridiculous. Killed 75 people. You know what I mean? And oh my God. So many avoidable incidents here that could have been totally avoided. Wow. But again, another great video from Mr. Ballen and 3 more great stories, even though the outcomes weren't that great. Anyway, what did you guys think of this reaction? Let me know in the comments. If you want to check out any more Mr. Ballen reactions, there'll be a playlist right up there. Don't forget to subscribe, and I shall see you all in the next video.